The letter had arrived that morning, slipped beneath the door of the servants' corridor, like something someone wanted found but couldn't hand over directly. It was addressed to no one. It was signed by no one. But Clara Whitmore recognized the handwriting on the envelope. She had spent 3 years cataloguing correspondence for the Hargrove estate, and she knew every curve and hesitation of Lady Cecilia Vane's pen. Inside were 11 words. "She knows what you did in London. Tonight, she will speak." Clara had read it 4 times, standing in the cold light of the corridor, still wearing her housekeeper's apron, still holding the ring of keys she had just retrieved from the pantry lock. Her hands had not trembled. That, she supposed, was the only thing she could be grateful for, because the problem was not the threat itself. The problem was that Lady Cecilia didn't know anything. There was nothing to know. Clara had been in London 3 years ago for a single purpose, to carry out a lawful and private matter on behalf of her late mother's estate, and she had returned before the week was out, quiet and unnoticed. There had been no scandal, there had been no impropriety, but that did not matter, did it? In a household where perception was currency, a whisper was enough. An accusation without substance could travel faster than any denial. And tonight was the Duke's annual winter reception. 40 guests, 3 tables, 2 sitting rooms, and a ballroom that Clara had spent the last 11 days organizing, with the precision of a woman who believed that excellence was its own argument. She folded the letter, placed it in the front pocket of her apron, and made a decision that most women in her position would not have made. She would not hide. She would not confess to a thing that had not happened. She would do her work, the work she had always done and done better than anyone in this house cared to acknowledge. And if Lady Cecilia Vane chose to make her move tonight, in front of the Duke and his guests, and every eye that had ever looked past Clara as if she were a piece of furniture, then so be it. Let them look. The woman who had managed Hargrove Manor through a flooding season, a cook's resignation, a disputed inheritance and a kitchen fire, all in the same autumn, was not going to disappear because someone wrote 11 words on expensive stationery. She tucked the keys into her pocket alongside the letter. Then she went to light the candles in the East Hall, because the guests would arrive in 3 hours, and the East Hall was always the first thing anyone noticed when they stepped through the front door. And Clara Whitmore had never once let the East Hall be anything less than perfect. She was not going to start tonight. Hargrove Manor sat on 12 acres of Derbyshire land that had belonged to the Hargrove family for 200 years, and it looked exactly like a house that knew it. The stone was old but kept, the gardens were formal but not cold, and the interior, every corridor, every room, every arrangement of flowers in every vase, bore the quiet signature of someone who understood that a house of this kind did not merely exist. It communicated. That someone was Clara Whitmore. She had come to Hargrove at 26, 3 weeks after the previous housekeeper's sudden departure, and 2 days before the then Duke, William Hargrove's father, was scheduled to receive a delegation from the Northern County Council. The house had been in mild disarray. Clara had arrived, assessed it in 2 hours, and had everything in order by morning. She had been hired permanently before noon. She was now 29. In 3 years she had learned the precise geography of Hargrove's moods. Which rooms accumulated cold in February, which windows needed sealing before October rain, which members of the staff required guidance through firm instruction, and which required only the appearance of trust to do their best work. She had learned when to speak to the Duke directly, and when to leave a written note, which he preferred for logistical matters, because he was a man who liked to think before he answered. William Hargrove, the 9th Duke of Esterfield, was not an easy man to read. He was not unkind. That was the first thing most people failed to understand about him. The coldness they perceived in him was not cruelty, it was economy. He did not spend words he hadn't earned. He did not perform warmth for audiences. He watched always with those pale grey eyes that seemed to register everything and reveal nothing, and the people who were unsettled by him were usually the ones who had something to conceal. Clara had never been unsettled by him. She understood reserve because she practiced it herself, and she had observed in 3 years of proximity that the Duke was a man of precise and deliberate fairness, the kind that did not make speeches, but showed up in how he treated a tenant farmer with the same attention he gave a lord, or how he corrected a solicitor's error in private rather than publicly, sparing the man his dignity. He was not warm, but he was just. Lady Cecilia Vane had entered his life 8 months ago, introduced through a mutual connection at a London gathering that Clara had organized the correspondence for. The engagement had followed with a speed that several members of the household had found surprising, though none said so aloud. Cecilia was beautiful in the way of portraits, precise, composed, designed to be looked at. She spoke beautifully. She moved beautifully. She asked all the correct questions and laughed at all the correct moments. And she had, from her first week at Hargrove, made it absolutely clear that she considered Clara's presence an imposition. Not loudly. Nothing with Cecilia was loud. It was in the way she redirected instructions Clara had already given, as though establishing authority that hadn't been challenged. It was in the way she spoke to Clara in front of others, politely, carefully, just slightly below the line of addressable rudeness, so that the slight landed but couldn't be held up and examined. Clara had absorbed all of it without comment. She had, in any case, larger things to manage. The winter reception was the most significant social event on the Hargrove calendar. 40 guests, 2 dukes, 3 earls, a baronet, and assorted members of county families whose connections to the Hargroves ranged from genuine friendship to careful alliance. The evening's success was not merely aesthetic, it carried weight, social, political, financial, and Clara had been organizing it for 6 weeks with the understanding that everything must be precisely right. As of 5 o'clock on the evening of the event, everything was. The flowers were arranged, the fires were lit. The silver was polished to a degree that had made the footman assigned to the task briefly emotional. The kitchen had produced 3 courses of impeccable food, and Clara had personally checked every setting on both dining tables, walking each length of white linen with an attention that she knew some would call excessive and she called necessary. She had also, at some point, stopped thinking about the letter, not because it had ceased to matter, but because thinking about it served no function. She had made her decision. She would do her work. Whatever Cecilia intended, it would happen or it would not, and Clara's behavior between now and then would be the only thing she could control. She was in the hallway near the drawing-room entrance when the Duke came down the east staircase. He stopped at the bottom, surveying the hall with the particular expression he wore when he was checking whether a thing had been done correctly. Not suspicious, simply thorough. His gaze moved across the flowers, the lit sconces, the arrangement of the entrance table. Then it moved to Clara. "Everything is in order," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." A pause. He looked at her for a moment longer than he usually did. "You look tired." Clara kept her expression composed. "It has been a busy fortnight, Your Grace." Another pause. Something moved behind his eyes, something she couldn't name. Then, "Tell Mrs. Alderton I want the cellar inventory adjusted before the guests arrive. The Bordeaux from the east rack. I'll see to it directly." He nodded, moved toward the drawing-room, and Clara stood very still for exactly 1 second after he left the hallway, before she turned and went to find Mrs. Alderton. She did not let herself think about the way he had looked at her. She had 40 guests arriving in 90 minutes. The guests arrived in the particular way of people who considered themselves important, which is to say, with great precision of timing and very little acknowledgement of the work required to receive them. Clara stood near the entrance hall and directed, quietly, efficiently, a word to the footman about the Earl of Whitley's coat, which he always handed over with more weight than one expected, a direction to the parlour maid about the fire in the blue sitting-room, which had burned lower than she liked. A silent exchange of glances with the butler, Mr. Fitch, that communicated 3 separate things without a word spoken. Lady Cecilia descended the main staircase at 7:30, and the room, as it always did, responded to her. She wore deep burgundy, pearls, and an expression of gracious possession, as though the house and everyone in it were already hers, already arranged for her benefit. She moved through the arriving guests with practiced ease. She kissed cheeks, admired jewellery, laughed at precisely the right moments. The Duke stood near the fire with 2 other gentlemen, and Clara noticed the way he observed Cecilia, Not with the warmth of a man in love, she thought, but with the cautious appreciation of someone watching a performance they had committed to attending. Clara did not let herself linger on the observation. At 9 o'clock, with the dinner service beginning and the guests moving toward the dining rooms, Clara slipped back through the connecting corridor to check on the kitchen. The second course was being plated. She conferred briefly with the cook, made one small adjustment to the arrangement, and was turning to return to the hall when she nearly collided with one of the parlour maids, young Agnes, 16 years old, who had been with the household for only 4 months. Agnes was pale. In her hands was a silver tray. On the tray were 2 crystal glasses of champagne, and down the front of Agnes's uniform was a spreading stain of dark red wine. Not champagne, Clara noted automatically. Wine, which meant it had come from somewhere else. And the girl's eyes were bright with the particular brightness of tears being held back through great and desperate effort. "Agnes," Clara said quietly. "What happened?" It was an accident, Miss Whitmore." The girl's voice was barely audible. "I was carrying the glasses through the side hall and Lady Cecilia's shawl was on the chair and I didn't see it, and the tray caught the edge and the glasses—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "One of them broke. It didn't break near the guests, miss. No one was hurt, but Lady Cecilia—" She couldn't finish. Clara understood before she did. "Go to the kitchen," Clara said. "Leave the tray with me. Tell Mrs. Alderton I sent you to change your uniform. Use the spare from the linen room, second shelf." "But Lady Cecilia said I was to—" "Agnes." Clara kept her voice calm and level, the way she always did when she wanted to be heard without alarm. "Go to the kitchen." Something in her tone settled the girl. Agnes handed over the tray, dipped a small, grateful curtsy, and went. Clara carried the tray back toward the side hall. She was 3 steps from the entrance when she heard Cecilia's voice, low, precise, carrying the particular quality of someone who was angry and had chosen performance over discretion. "I have already spoken to the girl once this evening about her carelessness, and I will not pretend that such clumsiness is acceptable in a house of this standing." Clara stepped through the doorway. Lady Cecilia stood in the center of the side hall with 2 of the female guests, a countess and her daughter, positioned on either side, close enough to have been drawn into the exchange without choosing it. On the floor nearby, a young footman was silently gathering the pieces of a broken champagne glass. The side hall was not isolated. Down the short corridor to the left, the door to the anteroom stood open. Clara could hear the murmur of guests. She could see, through the gap, the dark sleeve of a gentleman's coat. She set the tray on the hall table. "Lady Cecilia," she said. Her voice was clear and entirely without apology. "I believe the matter has been addressed." Cecilia turned. The warmth she had been performing for 40 guests vacated her expression the moment her eyes landed on Clara. What replaced it was not anger exactly. It was something more deliberate. "Miss Whitmore." The name was placed like something being set down with emphasis. "I was under the impression that the management of this household staff fell within your responsibility." "It does." "Then perhaps you might explain why a girl who has already been corrected for clumsiness tonight was permitted to—" "Agnes is 16, Clara said. "It is her first season in service. The glass broke without injury to any guest and without interruption to the dinner service. The matter is resolved." A pause opened between them. The countess near the wall had gone very still. The footman had stopped collecting glass. Cecilia's chin rose slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "The matter," Clara said, "is resolved." It was not defiance. It was completion. The flat, unornamented statement of a woman who had assessed the situation and determined it was finished. It did not leave a great deal of room for argument. Cecilia understood this. Her eyes narrowed only very slightly. And then she said, to no one in particular and everyone available, "I find that I am unsurprised by the quality of loyalty extended to incompetence in this household, though perhaps that speaks to something rather more than staff management." She let it rest there. Let it carry its suggestion into the room without quite landing as a statement. Clara said nothing. She picked up the repaired tray, turned, and walked back toward the main corridor with the same unhurried precision she had entered with. Behind her, she heard Cecilia begin to speak again, redirecting smoothly to the Countess, recovering the performance. Clara did not quicken her step. But she had seen in the last moment before she turned, through the open door of the anteroom, framed in the narrow gap between door and frame, a pair of pale grey eyes, still, watching. She had no way of knowing how long he had been there. The dinner service concluded without further incident. This was, in Clara's private accounting, something of a small miracle, not because the household was incapable, but because she had spent the remainder of the dinner in a state of careful, controlled alertness that left her very little room for anything else. She oversaw the removal of the second course, redirected a footman who had taken a wrong turn near the dining room entrance, and exchanged 3 words with Mr. Fitch about the timing of the dessert, all while maintaining the composed, unreadable expression that she had developed over years of managing situations that required more control than they were worth displaying. The guests had moved to the drawing-room for brandy and conversation. Clara remained in the corridor. It was 10:30 when Lady Cecilia found her. She came without the Countess, without her daughter, without any audience at all, which was, Clara recognized immediately, a different kind of approach from the earlier exchange. The performance was gone. What replaced it was something that Clara had suspected existed beneath the surface of Cecilia Vane, and had hoped, for simple pragmatic reasons, never to confirm. "I think," Cecilia said, stopping 4 feet away, "that we should speak plainly." "If you prefer," said Clara, "I know about London." She said it without any qualifying tone, not as an accusation, not as a revelation, simply as a fact being placed between them. "I know why you were there and what you did." Clara waited. This was the moment she had been preparing for since morning. She had thought, walking through it in every spare second of the day, about what it would feel like to be standing here. She had thought she might feel afraid. She had thought she might feel something close to desperate. She felt instead very tired of the whole thing. "Then you know," Clara said, "that there is nothing to know." Cecilia studied her. "I know that you spent a week in London in November of 1881 under circumstances that were not fully disclosed to your employer at the time. I had approved leave. You had approved leave. What you did with it is another matter." "I attended to my late mother's estate," Clara said, "as I informed the Duke's secretary when I requested the time, in writing, which is documented." A pause. Something shifted in Cecilia's composure, not dramatically, not in any way that most people would have caught. But Clara was not most people, and she saw it, the slight recalibration of someone whose position has turned out to be less solid than expected. "Documentation," Cecilia said carefully, "can be explained in many ways." "It can," Clara agreed. "So can the word of a solicitor, 2 witnesses and a county clerk, all of whom were present for the estate filing, and all of whom, should anyone have reason to inquire, would confirm exactly what I've told you." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Clara had prepared for this too, not with satisfaction, but with the simple steadiness of someone who had told the truth and knew the particular solidity of that ground underfoot. She had done nothing wrong in London. She had never done anything wrong anywhere. And she had spent 3 years being managed, redirected, and looked past by people who assumed that her position was equivalent to her worth, and she was very, very finished with the assumption. "You should understand," Cecilia said at last, her voice returned to its careful evenness, "that I have some influence over decisions made in this household, more than you may appreciate." "I appreciate it exactly as much as it deserves," Clara said. Another silence, and then, something Clara had not expected, Cecilia almost smiled. It was not kind, but it was, in some unnerving way, acknowledging. "You are not what I expected," she said. "No," Clara agreed. "I rarely am." She turned to go. She was 3 steps away when Cecilia said quietly, "I will find something, you know. Eventually." Clara stopped. She did not turn back. "You are welcome to look," she said, and continued walking. She had gone perhaps 12 feet down the corridor when she became aware, with a precision she could not explain, that she was not alone. She turned. The Duke was standing at the far end of the corridor, not near enough to have heard everything. She could not know what he had heard. His face told her nothing, It never did. But he was watching her with that particular quality of attention that she had learned over 3 years, meant that he was thinking something he had not yet decided how to say. They looked at each other across the corridor for the length of a breath. Then Clara said very simply, "Your Grace." He said nothing. She walked past him and returned to the East Hall. Her hands, she noted with some satisfaction, had not trembled once. The guests began departing at 11:30. Clara oversaw it with her usual efficiency. Coats retrieved, carriages called, farewells managed with appropriate ceremony. The Earl of Whitley's coat, as expected, was heavier than it looked. The baronet's wife had left a glove in the blue sitting room, which a parlour maid retrieved and delivered to the carriage with 20 seconds to spare. By midnight, the house was quiet. Clara was in the library, not because the library required attention, but because she had found over 3 years that the library at midnight was the place in Hargrove Manor where she could think without interruption. It smelled of old paper and cedar, and the fire there burned long after the others, and she had never once been disturbed in it. She was reviewing the evening's accounts, a habit, a form of accountability she maintained for herself, regardless of what the day had contained, when the door opened. She had expected Mr. Fitch, or possibly no one. The Duke walked in, stopped inside the door and looked at her in the way of a man who has been looking for something and found it exactly where he thought it might be. Clara stood. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon, I'll leave you to—" "Stay." She stayed. He moved to the chair across the writing table from her and sat, which was not something he typically did in rooms where she was working. He looked at the fire for a moment, then at her. "Tell me about London," he said. Clara had been expecting this since she'd seen him in the corridor. She had been arranging the words for the better part of an hour. "In November of 1881, she said, "my mother died. She had a small property, not valuable, simply a matter of legal transfer. I had myself named executor of her estate. I took approved leave to file the appropriate documents with the county office. I was there for 6 days. I returned on a Sunday." A pause. "That is everything," she said. The Duke held her gaze. "And Lady Cecilia's version?" "Lady Cecilia's version," Clara said carefully, "was built on the assumption that an undisclosed absence suggested something worth concealing. She was incorrect." Something moved across his face. Not surprise, more like a confirmation of something he had already reached on his own. "You knew about the letter," he said. It was not a question. Clara met his eyes. "Yes. And you came to work anyway." "I am employed to run this household," she said. "A letter doesn't change that." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. The room was very still. "I was in the ante-room," he said at last, "during the conversation in the side hall. Clara had known. She had seen the sleeve. She said nothing. And I was at the end of the corridor," he continued, "during the later conversation. The later one. He had heard more than she'd thought then. She calculated quickly how far he'd been, what would have carried, and decided to let it rest where it was." "I see," she said. He looked at the fire again. She watched his profile, the composed set of it, the quality of someone processing something they were not going to speak carelessly. "Lady Cecilia and I," he said slowly, "had a conversation this evening." He paused. "Several conversations, in fact." Clara waited. He said nothing more, and then, this was the thing she would remember, the thing she would turn over quietly in her mind in the months that followed. He reached inside his coat and set something on the table between them. It was the letter, not the one she had received. A different one. She could see from where she sat that it was addressed in his hand, sealed with the Hargrove crest, and that it bore today's date. She did not pick it up. She did not ask. He stood, smoothed his coat, looked at her once more with those pale, unreadable eyes. "The position of estate manager," he said, "has been vacant since my father's time. The salary is 3 times your current arrangement. The responsibilities are broader, but I suspect you have been performing most of them already." He moved toward the door. At the threshold, without turning back, he said, "The letter is an offer, not a requirement. Read it when you're ready." He left. Clara stood alone in the library, the fire burning low, the letter sitting on the table in front of her. She did not move for a long moment. Then she sat down very slowly and picked it up. 3 days passed. The morning after the reception, Lady Cecilia Vane had breakfast at 8 o'clock, made no reference to anything that had occurred the night before, and by 11 o'clock had sent a message to her mother in London that was, as far as anyone in the household could determine, entirely unrelated to the Duke's invitation list. By the following afternoon she had returned to London. No formal announcement was made. The Duke said nothing to the household. Mr. Fitch said nothing. Clara said nothing. The staff, with the particular sensitivity of people who observed a great deal and were rarely asked their opinion of it, said very little, at least within earshot. Life at Hargrove Manor continued. Clara ran the house as she always had. She oversaw the post-reception inventory, returned the borrowed chair covers to the village hall, arranged for the east window to be resealed before the December cold made it urgent, and settled a small dispute between the cook and the under-gardener about the kitchen garden that had been quietly festering for 6 weeks. She did not speak to the Duke. She saw him in the way she always had, passing in corridors, exchanging the brief, functional communications that the management of a house required. He asked about the east window. She reported on its progress. He reviewed a document she had prepared about the tenant's winter provisions and made one marginal note. She incorporated it. Normal, precise, exactly as it had always been. On the third morning, she set the letter on his desk. She had written her response on a single sheet in the careful hand she used for important correspondence, and it said the following: Your Grace, I accept with gratitude. I would ask only that the responsibilities of the position be clearly defined in writing before I assume them, not because I question your intentions, but because clarity has always served this household better than assumption. I am prepared to begin when it suits you. C. Whitmore. She did not wait for a response. She had a household to run. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, she was in the linen room counting the winter supply of table linens. There were, as she had suspected, 4 short, which would need to be ordered before December, when Agnes appeared in the doorway. Miss Whitmore. His Grace asked if you have a moment. Tell His Grace I'll be there directly. She finished her count, noted the shortage in the household ledger, and went. He was in the study, standing at the window that looked out over the east garden, which was bare now, formal and grey-brown with November. He did not turn when she entered. The terms of the position are here, he said, and indicated a document on the desk. I had the solicitor draw them up yesterday. You'll find it meets what you asked for. Clara picked up the document, read it. It was, she observed, thorough, more thorough than she had expected, with specifics about authority, reporting, salary, and one clause near the end that gave her full discretion in matters of staff conduct without requiring the engagement of any other party. The last clause, she thought, was not an accident. This is satisfactory, she said. He turned then, looked at her across the room. I want to say something, and he said, in the careful way of a man who has been choosing words. Clara waited. I am aware, he said slowly, that this house has not always, that certain arrangements. He stopped, began again. You have managed this household for 3 years with a standard of competence that I have not adequately acknowledged. I should have done so earlier. I did not. The admission landed quietly in the particular way of things said without performance. Clara looked at him for a moment. The work, she said, was its own acknowledgement. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not in any way that most people would have registered, but she caught it. Nevertheless, he said. Nevertheless, she agreed. She tucked the document under her arm. I'll sign the copy and return it before 5. Was there anything else? He looked at her for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the question she had asked. No, he said, that will be all. She moved to the door. Miss Whitmore. She stopped. The linen shortage, he said. 4 settings. I noticed it last week. I should have mentioned it sooner. Clara turned and looked at him. Really looked at him. For perhaps the first time in 3 years, without the management of everything between them. He was watching her with something that was not quite a smile and not quite a question, and was, she thought, entirely its own thing. "I have already ordered replacements," she said. "They will arrive by Thursday." He nodded once, very slightly. She left. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday, it snowed. Clara was in the East Hall when it started, standing at the window at the end of the corridor, holding the morning's correspondence, watching the first white settle over the garden with the particular stillness of early snowfall. She heard him before she saw him, the precise, unhurried footfall she could have identified in any room. He stopped beside her at the window. Neither of them said anything. The garden was going white by increments, each line of hedge and each bare branch acquiring its slow, careful layer. After a long moment he said, "There is a matter in the spring tenant reports that I would appreciate your view on, when you have time." "I'll review them this afternoon," she said. "There's no urgency." "There rarely is," she said. "Until there is." The corner of his mouth moved barely. They stood at the window a moment longer. Then Clara turned, tucked the correspondence under her arm, and walked back toward the main corridor and the 12 matters that required her attention before noon. The snow continued to fall. The East Hall was warm and clean and exactly as it should be.